Thank you very much for the introduction. You can all hear me, I'm assuming. Let me say first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here. This is not a formal statement of the kind that you can expect because I'm well aware of the history of this extraordinary university. I think the university has seen better days. We won't get into that particular question. But I should also say that I'm also pleased that actually this conversation or lecture is being held outdoors because I think one of the many fallacies of modern times is the idea that all learning takes place in something called a classroom. That was never the case historically in most civilizations, and certainly not in India. And I think that if we're trying to understand, for example, the culture of autodidacts, we'd have to see, that is, people who have taught themselves or people who have learned in other institutional settings, we can see why it is a mistake to suppose that the university is the only place for learning, particularly this bounded place called the classroom. I should also say that I'm not really here to deliver a formal scholarly talk. Himanshu had broached the subject with me some time ago, and I told him that because initially there was a discussion about the possibility of speaking on Indian politics or on something like caste, and I said there are enough people at JNU who can do that, and some of them I'm sure can do it much better than I can. So that I don't take that as my brief at all. What I really want to speak about is, as has been conveyed in the title, and of course I'm going to explicate what I mean by that, is India and the world, the politics of the past, and our uncommon or common futures. And I should also say that this talk is not, I'm sure that all of you are a very sophisticated bunch of people because I've had PhD, I've had students with MAs and MPhils who have come from JNU to UCLA, and everyone seems to have read their Foucault and their Heidegger and their Levinas and their John Rawls, etc., and there'll be no invocations to any of these suspects or to Judith Butler or anything of that kind. You'll see that I'm going to build my arguments in very different ways. I think we live in a strange moment. We live in very dark and perilous times. It is also, I think, the case that in every age, people think they're going through the worst possible times that anybody could have gone through. I mean, imagine you were living during World War II. And you were living in one of the cities that was being firebombed day after day. Imagine you were living through the Holocaust. You were Jewish or Polish or a communist, and you were living through the Holocaust. Or imagine that you were living through the Rwandan genocide or through the killings that we had in this country in 1947 at the time of partition. Now, if you were living through those times, you would be well justified in thinking that you were living through the darkest times that anybody had ever lived through. Right? So I recognize that. And that's why, of course, every age needs its own poets, prophets, and philosophers. Precisely because of that. Right? We do have to reinvent the wheel, unfortunately. And I want to say to you that notwithstanding everything I've said, I still think that we are actually living at the conjuncture of certain forces which makes our times very perilous, far more so than they have ever been. Because I think actually human existence and planetary existence is at stake today. And that's really what I want to speak about. Right? So when I say conjuncture, I have in mind a number of things. I'm going to just spell out 6 of those in the first 5 to 6 minutes. Just 5 or 6 elements of that particular conjuncture, which makes this a very unusual time. Right? And we could add some more to it, but these are the ones that, and I've got a sort of a short book that I hope to do by the side at some point on this set of conjunctures that I'm really speaking about. The first is that much of the democratic world appears to be lurching towards the right. Right? I don't want to be here detained by the consideration, which may be legitimate, whether we ever had a democracy. I know that if you read Arundhati Roy, she'll tell you we've never had a democracy for a moment. Fine, right? You can take that view. There's nothing left to discuss then, frankly, about any kind of backsliding that we might have. I'm well aware of the fact that we can also put into question whether the United States was a democracy. Yes, the First Amendment rights, as they're called in the US, that is, the right to freedom of speech and expression, those are much stronger in the US, or used to be, than in any other country that I'm aware of, the First Amendment rights. But at the same time, we know that the US has been a genocidal nation. Right? And I'm not going to enumerate all the list of countries that the United States has bombed. We'll be here until midnight discussing each of those. Right? So I have no illusions about that. I'm quite candid about that. Whether there ever really was a democracy for others, all of that, we'll leave that aside. Let's just assume that at least in common parlance, that we have thought of the US and India and several other countries as democracies, and all of these have shown a perilous, precipitous decline. That's the first thing that we have to think about when we're really thinking about this conjuncture of a number of circumstances which makes our times very unusual. Right? The second phenomenon is global warming. Global warming. I mean, when you look at the election manifestos of our parties, you wouldn't think that there is such a thing called global warming. I have read through the election manifestos of the Congress and the BJP. Whatever other ideological differences there are between these parties, I can tell you that in the election manifestos, both for the last general election and the 2 previous ones, there is virtually no mention, a short paragraph at most. At most, a very short paragraph. And if we're not attentive to global warming, we won't have anything left to discuss in 25 years. You can be quite sure about that. There's a whole vocabulary that has come out as a consequence of global warming. For example, such things as climate refugees. Nobody ever heard that phrase 3-4 decades ago. Right? It is real, global warming. There is clinching evidence. The cavemen who now form part of the American administration, because they're really cavemen, they're troglodytes. They'll tell you there is no such thing as global warming. It's there. And you don't have to be a bhakt of science, to believe that there is something called global warming. There's substantial evidence across a huge number of disciplines about what constitutes global warming and the experience of people, which tells us that this is something that is really very real. Third, there is insurmountable evidence of growing inequality. Hugely growing inequality within every nation, and to some extent between nations. I say to some extent because you could argue the opposite. You could say that, well, now we have seen the rise of China, so that shows that the inequality that existed between nations is diminishing. We know that manufacturing capacities in countries such as Vietnam has grown tremendously. Right? But nevertheless, I think that there is, again, insurmountable evidence of this growing inequality. And remember, once again, I am not saying that there hasn't been inequality before. I'm saying it's the conjuncture of a set of circumstances which makes our times very unusual. I've identified 3 of those elements thus far. Fourthly, technology has introduced a gap that we are not in the position of comprehending. What do I mean by that? Very simply. On the one hand, the pace of technological change is astounding. Right? And I'll tell you stories much as you'll tell stories, to your children and grandchildren, which will show these gaps. So when I was growing up, I grew up in the age when there was carbon paper. And you got things cyclo-styled. And then there was the typewriter. I wrote my PhD dissertation, the first portion of it, on a typewriter, and then the computer just came in at that time. Right? And then, of course, the pace at which computers do calculations, when they say that a computer can do 5 billion calculations in a second, I don't know what that means actually. I mean, if anybody does, I'd be very happy to hear it, what exactly they understand by that. I don't understand what that actually really means. Okay? But that's what I mean. It's the pace. On the other hand, there is absolutely no evidence that our moral vocabulary and our moral sensibilities have grown an iota. If anything, they have diminished. Let me give you an illustration, a strange one, you might say to yourself. But there is a kind of vocabulary that used to be part of the vocabulary of public life. For example, the idea of shame. That a politician gets caught in some kind of scandal, so they're shamed, and therefore they'll withdraw. Now it's a badge of honor to actually be involved in a scandal and then be openly brazen about it and not worry at all. So shame is not part of our moral vocabulary. Just like the word reverence is not part of our moral vocabulary, I would say. Right? But what I'm simply trying to suggest, if you don't like either of these two examples, discard them. The question is whether the argument still stands, because the argument I'm really giving here simply is this, that there is a huge gap between technological growth and the fact that our moral reasoning, our capacity for moral reasoning, the way in which we articulate a vision of the world, which has some normative value, that gap has grown. It has grown enormously. Fifth, we don't have any control whatsoever over AI. I don't think we have the slightest idea what AI might possibly do, how AI might possibly be used. It might possibly even be used to launch nuclear attacks at some point. We certainly know that AI is used now in ways of warfare which have completely changed the rules of warfare altogether. The United States is a singularly interesting example, although of course you know that Pakistan and India both used drones recently. You have to use AI now for some of that. We know that Russia and Ukraine in the conflict that's been taking place, and we know, by the way, that Israel is one of the countries that's foremost in the use of AI. If you've ever thought about how is it that they've been able to penetrate so successfully, okay, Hezbollah, Hamas networks, all of that, you have to think about the very advanced technologies that Israel in particular deploys. And there's a substantial amount of literature that is beginning to emerge about that. We might think that we drive AI. I think that that's a completely mistaken conception. And sixthly, and the list is not exhaustive, the sixth thing which forms part of this conjuncture, as I'm describing it, is the figure of the migrant. Now, people have been moving for centuries. Since the dawn of history, people have been moving. And so you would be well within your rights to ask, well, how is the figure of the migrant any different today? And I think it is different. And when I say migrant here, I'm well aware of the differences between refugees and immigrants and exiles. Again, I'm aware of that. I know that some people choose to emigrate, some don't, some are compelled into moving. If you look at the population of Syria, half of the Syrians live outside Syria because of the civil war and the dictatorship that this country went through for over a decade. Okay? But the figure of the migrant has become central in every country. There's a driver I know. Let's begin with India, for example. There's a driver I know. He's a Muslim driver. Right? And this Muslim driver, whom I know very well under circumstances that I don't have to explain right now because that's completely not germane to the story, told me that he lives in a place in Gurgaon, and there have been a number of occasions in the last 2 months when, and I'm sure all of you are aware of this, right, when the police just simply came down and swept away part of these people who are all Muslims, Bengali speaking. They're actually, none of them is Bangladeshi. Of course, I would want to ask, if they're Bangladeshi, that can't be an excuse for violating their rights as a human being. But leave that aside, because there are going to be very few takers for that, particularly in the political climate that we live in today. I'm talking about people who are citizens of this country who happen to be from West Bengal and they're Bengali speakers. That person is a migrant. They have moved. That figure of the migrant, everything is now turning on that in almost every country of the world. Sweden used to be one of the most hospitable countries, at least so they said. And if you've really been reading about what's been happening in Sweden over the course of the last 3 years, they are attempting to make it almost impossible for refugees, and I have to tell you, virtually all these refugees are Muslim refugees, right? Coming predominantly from Syria, but also coming from Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, in Sweden, right? And stripping these people of their citizenship rights. And of course, I don't need to spell out, because I'm sure all of you, even if you're not reading, the newspapers anymore and just getting all your news from the so-called WhatsApp university, right? Or from social media, well, you know exactly what's happening in the United States. The xenophobic fervor with which the immigrant has become a figure at which the fury of the state is being directed. All right? That's a conjuncture of circumstances which makes our times extremely unusual and perilous and dark. So here is the question. How should we understand all of this in India? More precisely, what should India's place be in the world? How has India's place been understood in the recent past by people living in this country? And how did Indians negotiate their way around the world? Not necessarily or even mainly through travel, since comparatively few Indians, for example, in colonial India, were in the position of being able to travel overseas, but traveling intellectually, creatively, imaginatively, right? I can't go into the distant past. I just returned from Hyderabad, and one of the things I did when I was in Hyderabad was I went to the Qutub Shahi tombs. Now it's an absolutely intellectual exercise of a highest order to understand what is happening. Because the people there, the rulers, they had very close links with the Persianate world. Usually because we are sitting here in North India, the only time we think of the Persian world is in relationship to the Mughals. And we know that Persian was the language of administration, even used by the British for a period of time, before, of course, Macaulay's Minute and all of that, which I don't need to get into, right? But the fact of the matter is that the Deccani or Bahmani sultanates were, in fact, if anything, had an even richer association with the Persianate world. I'll give you a proposition here. You can spend a lot of time trying to unravel it. If you're looking at Indian history, the narrative that the colonial state gave to us, which was passed down to many people, was this idea of Indian provincialism being defeated by modernizing Europe. I'm very sorry to say it's exactly the other way around. It is our cosmopolitanism that made us vulnerable. I mean, the English are the most parochial and provincial people that you've ever seen. And if you really look at what was happening in the South, or if you look at the kind of links that we had with the Gulf, with Southeast Asia, with the east coast of Africa, we had these links that went back to centuries. And one of the consequences of colonialism was to eviscerate even the memory of these links, because the real consequence was that now everything had to be mediated through the West. Right? I mean, you look at yourself over here. If you wanted to associate with students from Iran, from Iraq, from Somalia, from Sudan, from Burma, or Myanmar as it's called now, not to mention obviously countries in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, where would you do that? You do it at an American university. Everything gets mediated through the West. This was the consequence of colonialism. It had extraordinary consequences for how we understood the world. But that's going into the distant past. I want to take a look more at the 20th century to understand what India's place was in the world. So let me first turn to two incidents. I think the second of these, I think the likelihood is that almost all of you, or many of you would have heard of. I doubt that many of you would have heard of this first incident that I'm going to describe, and you'll see exactly why I'm going to describe these two incidents. So the first incident I'm going to describe is an incident that took place in Alabama, which is a state in the American South in 1931. It's called the Scottsboro incident. Okay? And it concerns 9 young black boys who were accused of raping 2 white women on a train that was going from Chattanooga to Memphis. In record time, all 9 were convicted and sentenced to death on the electric chair. The case went to appeal. Okay, it went to appeal to the Alabama court. I can't narrate the whole history, because this is going to go on for 2 years. It's going to go to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is going to send it back to the Alabama Supreme Court, overturning the convictions, but overturning the convictions not on substantive grounds, although everyone knew this was completely fraudulent. Completely fraudulent. And if you wanted to trap a black person in America, all you had to do was simply say that he had in fact raised his eyes before a white woman. That was enough to get you lynched in some places. Okay? Completely fraudulent case. And what is the technicality? That everybody who was sitting on the jury was a white person. What are the chances in the world that 9 young black boys being accused of raping 2 white women are going to be exonerated by a jury of white men in the American South? 0. Absolutely 0. Right? And so this whole thing goes on for 2 years. Okay? That's the incident. And I'll tell you in a moment, after I've described the second incident, why I'm mentioning this incident to you. So what is the second incident? The second incident is the Nazi burning of books. The Nazi burning of books. When they came to power, they would make a bonfire of books that were supposed to be contaminated, either because they were written by Jewish philosophers or were too sympathetic to Jews, etc., etc. Okay? We know there's another person who burnt a book. And in fact, I saw on this very campus, I still have the video, an enactment of that. And that was the burning of the Manusmriti by Ambedkar. Okay? Now, I have no defense to offer on behalf of the Manusmriti, but nevertheless, I would critique the burning of the Manusmriti. Okay? I would critique it. Because once you start with one book, you go down the road of burning other books too. And I can also tell you that there are philosophers such as Henry David Thoreau, the great American writer whose essay on the duty of civil disobedience becomes one of the fundamental texts of political resistance, who absolutely adored the Manusmriti. Why he did so is a story I can't get into right now. But what I'm saying is that the text that you might simply deplore might well be a text that can be salvaged by someone else who's a thinking person. Okay? Now, why do I mention these? Because imagine that we had an Indian playwright who wrote a play on both these incidents. Right? If we're thinking about transnational solidarities, if we're thinking about India's relationship to the world, so here is the book called Barricade by Utpal Dutt. You know that Utpal Dutt, of course, I mean, many of you know of him as an actor who played a wonderfully comic role in the film Golmaal, okay? And you know him, of course, for this extraordinary performance he had in Bhuvan Shom, the film Bhuvan Shom by Mrinal Sen. If you haven't it, go and run and see the film. It's an absolute masterpiece of cinema, okay? Right? And the Scottsboro incident, here's a book, also by Utpal Dutt, The Rights of Man. The whole play is on the Scottsboro incident. Manusher, right? Adhikare, the rights of man. Now, what was Utpal Dutt doing? How did he get interested in? How did he enter into that world? Right? How do we imagine the possibilities of transnational solidarities? And you know, of course, that Utpal Dutt also wrote another play. In fact, it was a play for which he became most well known outside the work he did related strictly to Indian conditions and Indian theater and all of that. And this was a play called Invincible Vietnam. And it's understandable why Utpal Dutt would pick on Vietnam, because that was, the war in Vietnam was globally becoming the axis around which people were forming solidarities. Okay? So you can understand why he would have picked on Vietnam. And I want to here relate a little incident from this extraordinary film, another film by Satyajit Ray. It's called Pratidwandi. And there is a scene where the character goes for an interview. Now, he's gone for many interviews for jobs, but here you actually see the interview. It's priceless, this scene that is shown. So he's sitting here before a panel of 3 men who then say, would you describe to us what do you think was the most significant of the last decade? And so the hero here, he pauses, there's a long pause, and then he says, the war in Vietnam. And there's a long pause on the other side. You know, this is a corporate job. You don't go around telling the people who are interviewing for a corporate job that you think that the most significant event is the war in Vietnam. And so the head honcho of this panel of 3 says, more significant than the landing on the moon? And our hero pauses again and says, I think so, sir, because that was important. I'm not saying it wasn't important, but it was bound to happen. It's predictable. It's predictable. And so then the interviewer says, well, what do you think is not predictable about the Vietnam War? And then the hero pauses and says, you know, it's not the war that was unpredictable. It is what it has revealed about the Vietnamese people, about their extraordinary power of resistance. Ordinary people, peasants. And no one knew they had it in them. And no one knew they had it in them and this isn't a matter of technology. It's just plain human courage. And he says, what could be more marvelous than a rice-eating peasantry defeating the mightiest military machine in the world. Right? Now this is, so think about what Utpal Dutt is doing. But let's take a very different example, because remember what I'm trying to do here. What I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to illustrate for all of you, what does it mean to think about India's place in the world? And that means thinking about the associations that India has had with other countries, and how our intellectuals and how our poets and philosophers and many others, thank you, sorry, how they have responded to all of this. So let me tell you very briefly the story of Ninasam. Is there anyone here who knows what Ninasam is? Okay, I don't see a single hand up. All right. So Ninasam is a cultural experiment that started in a very small one-street village in northwestern Karnataka in 1949. That village is called Hegudu. Okay? There was a man there. He was a farmer. And he was a farmer, and so you know what the most of the farming there is the areca nut, the betel nut. He was a betel nut farmer. In 1949, he started to get a little bit interested in theater. So he started reading a little bit about theater, and then it struck him, why not bring this theater to the villagers? Right? And slowly this experiment started to grow. It started to include cinema, because in 1967, the then director of the National Film Archive, a very, very remarkable man by the name of P.K. Nair, who ran what was India's first film appreciation course. All right? And in this film appreciation course, what happened? That Subanna, who is this farmer, who takes this course in 1967 and then says to P.K. Nair, I would like to bring the films of Kurosawa and Antonioni and the Italian neorealists and Ozu and Truffaut and Godard. I would like to bring them to the villagers. And that's exactly what flowered into this extraordinary workshop. They eventually built an auditorium. It's actually surreal. It's bizarre. Why is it surreal? Because, you're walking this plantation and then suddenly you see this opera house. Massive. It's like an opera house. And I was there 15 years ago for a whole week. And one of the plays they staged was Aristophanes' The Birds. Okay? And I don't know if any of you is familiar with that play. It's a remarkable play because it's a comedy. And in this, what this comedy is most well known for is that, the men, Aristophanes was a contemporary of Euripides, Sophocles, and all of these people. Okay? We're talking about 5th century BCE in Greece. He was a contemporary of all of them. Yeah? And what was happening in the Greek world at that time? Constant warfare. The men were constantly going to war. So the women get fed up. So they decide to conduct a sex strike. That is that all the women tell their husbands, we're not going to have any sex with you anymore because unless you give up war. That's what this play is about. Imagine bringing a play of this kind to this village called Hegudu in northwestern Karnataka. Right? Now, you see, this is the kind of world that I am suggesting we have to think about. Okay, I've been told that I have 5 minutes. That was about 2 minutes ago, but I'll still take the liberty of speaking for about 5-7 minutes. All right? So, I want to move simply to the last portion of my remarks. I haven't said anything about Palestine. I'll be happy to speak about Palestine later on during the Q&A. I've written about Palestine. I've got very strong feelings about Palestine. But remember, one of the things that I've suggested for you is that if we're going to think about India's place in the world, we also have to think about parts of the world that we don't normally think about. Right? What is it, for example, that we can take from South Africa? South Africa went through an anti-apartheid struggle. We went through an anti-colonial struggle here. They went through an anti-apartheid struggle. That anti-apartheid struggle was very remarkable. And it's also interesting that there are a significant number of Indians involved in that struggle. I'm talking about South African Indians, people who had been born in that country. I'm talking about people like Ahmed Khatrada, Billy Nair, Mac Maraj, Ismail Mir, Fatima Mir, Indres Naidu. We're talking about dozens of these Indians. Okay? Now, it's very instructive because it was a minority in a black majority country. How did they come to terms? What are the ways in which they negotiated? And one of the extraordinary things about South Africa is precisely the fact that its struggle was a multiracial struggle. It's a very instructive example for us to think about, and remember that it is South Africa that went to the ICJ on the Palestine issue. The one country that had the daring to do that. One reason they did it, of course, is they understand that history. They recognize apartheid when they see it. There's no question about that. Okay? Right? So, if I had to think about how we're going to move forward, right? I go back to the question, what is the place of India in the world? Let me sketch my conclusion through 3 observations or vignettes. The first observation, I had 2 parts. I'm going to cut out one in the interest of time. In 1924, Rabindranath Tagore went to China. And he delivered a set of talks. These talks were delivered in English and published in English. This is not part of his Bangla writings. We know that the bulk of what he wrote is in Bangla, but he wrote quite extensively in English as well. So there's this magnificent 4-volume edition of the English writings of Rabindranath Tagore, which has been published by the Sahitya Academy, quite inexpensive, where you can find the talks in China. Now, one of the talks that he gives in China, what does he say? He says he's trying to explain the nature of Indian civilization. All right? And he says, he says that I want to describe a story that he says I witnessed myself. He says that he was traveling outside Calcutta, about 100 kilometers away from China, by car in the early 1920s. And the radiator heats up. Now, you know what you have to do when a radiator heats up. You stop the car and you pour water on it. You let it cool down a bit and then you move on. He was 100 kilometers from China. He was traveling through a drought-stricken area. He says what astonished him was that every 5 kilometers or so he had to stop. They had to put water again. Every village there, the area is drought-stricken. In every village, the villagers would find a little bit water, and they would come and they would give it to him, and it would be poured on the radiator. And he's saying, you know, if there had been an American here, he would have said, yaar, ye to bahut paise bana sakta hu main. I'm going to charge, 100 rupees for every little tumbler of water I'm going to give. And he says these people are selflessly giving this water even when they don't have water for themselves. How do you explain it? And he says, there's only one word that explains it. He said, it's part of our dharma. And he says, this requires centuries of training. Centuries of training. And he's trying to explain the nature of this civilization. It's an amazing illustration. And then, of course, he then develops a whole more elaborate worldview. All right? Secondly, I want to remind us, all the more important in the present climate, when the achievements of many of those who were involved in the freedom struggle are being undermined, that the anti-colonial struggle in India was distinct. Absolutely distinct. It was distinct. And I'm not here talking about the experiment in democracy, which was also distinct after India achieved independence. How you would actually get an electorate of that size, okay, to exercise universal franchises is a story in itself. I'm speaking about the anti-colonial struggle itself. The Congress's, whatever its limitations, was distinct. Its nationalism was distinct in that it was driven by anti-imperialism. And of course, Indian democracy would derive its justification. It would demand a new justification based on that. When I say it was driven by anti-imperialism, it was not driven by the kinds of things that drove nationalism all over Europe. It wasn't the idea of blood, kith or kin. It was anti-imperialism. That was the core. You could be Madan Mohan Malviya and you could be viewed as someone who was too staunchly Hindu, but at the end of the day, Madan Mohan Malviya and Lajpat Rai, all these people were animated by a certain kind of anti-imperialism. Read their lives very carefully to see how that was a part of their lives as well. We have to understand the manner in which this anti-imperialism was the core of it, and it was this anti-imperialism that enabled transnational solidarities. You know, our present administration might say, Nehru ne ye kiya, wo kiya, and they're clueless about the strengths of this man. And it's important to mention him because we are at a university named after Jawaharlal Nehru. In 1927, he goes to Brussels for an anti-imperialist conference. And the people who are in the administration now, they don't even understand what imperialism, anti-imperialism, any of that means. They're illiterates. They don't have the vocabulary, the moral understanding for any of that. Let's be very clear. I'm going to be very blunt about it. That's the only way to think about it. And as I said, there is a critique to be made. Certainly. There were elements of authoritarianism present in Nehru as they were in Gandhi and many others, but those critiques have their place. We are speaking about something fundamentally different here. And finally, and lastly, this very anti-colonial struggle also presents to us stellar examples of interculturality. Interculturality. Tagore, Gandhi, Nehru, Maulana Azad, Loya, many others, they had a complex relationship with the West, as indeed they did with Indian culture. They had a very complex relationship. There was never any wholesale rejection of the West, nor was there simply a matter of unexamined adulation of the West. Okay? But this is obvious. The point is they actually lived between cultures. That is what interculturality means, I want to suggest to you. If you adopt the anthropologist view, they were able to take both the emic and the etic view at the same time. That is what is really quite distinct. And from there we have to then move to thinking about the fact that we are in the midst of a planetary crisis. We have to think about ourselves in the vortex of a planetary existence, right? See, I think for those of you of this generation, one of the key words of your existence has been identity. That's been one of the key words of your existence, right? And if I had to encapsulate the developments on university campuses in most countries that I'm aware of, certainly in India and the US, politics has been driven by identity. People derive their politics from their identity. If you're gay, you advocate for gay rights. If you're Dalit, you advocate for Dalit rights. And so forth and so on, right? I have always found that, I'm going to be very plain about it, a rather impoverished way of looking at the world. If there is one thing a university education might aim at, it should be to help students derive their identity from their politics. The other way around. Okay? That has a wider set of implications because the most emancipatory politics should help us move toward an understanding of the ways in which a human-centered view of the world has spelled disaster for the idea of planetary existence. Just go back to the French Revolution. Go back to the American Declaration of Independence, which, by the way, even Ho Chi Minh used to cite all the time. Okay? All right? Now, these documents, I conclude with this aphorism from Walter Benjamin. So my sole invocation to the great theorists here this evening. And if you've ever read a book by him called Illuminations, and within Illuminations you'll find these theses on the philosophy of history. And within that there is this aphorism where he says, there is no great document of civilization that is not at the same time a document of barbarism. And that's exactly the problem of the kind of view of modernity and the view of rights and identity that we began to inherit from the Enlightenment, from the French Revolution. Because these documents become documents they are the charter for the human-centric view which has led us to this planetary crisis that we are facing today. Thank you.